Hi everyone. Well, it's spring and I am inspired. I got inspired to get out in the garden. I did some landscaping. I'm doing spring cleaning. And today I want to talk about a very particular kind of inspiration, and that is the inspiration to write and the books that help us to find that inspiration. So I have to turn on my reading device here. I'm currently teaching one of my favorite classes that I've designed and I've taught many times at the MFA level, and that is called the Writer's Boot Camp. And the book that I use when I'm teaching this course, the book I use now, I've used different books. Stephen Pressfield's The War of Art was the book I started with that course, and I also love that book and I highly recommend it. The book I'm using now is called Keep Going by Austin Kleon, and the subtitle is 10 Ways to Stay Creative in Good Times and Bad. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend reading it if you are a writer. It's eminently readable, it's very approachable, but it just has some really, really solid words of gentle wisdom. And sort of unlike Pressfield, and one of the things I loved about the Pressfield book is that he's sort of not so gentle words of wisdom. He comes at it from sort of almost a classic military perspective. So it is, in that case, it was very, in that sense rather, it was very useful for the boot camp course. This one's a little more gentle, the Cleon book, but it is nonetheless really wonderful, and I find that students just love it. I have many craft books on the bookshelves behind me, and I love my craft books. I think many of us do. But sometimes, rather than just studying the craft of how to be a better writer or things we can try when it comes to improving our skills as a writer, sometimes just getting to the writing is challenging. And so when we can find some inspiration from people who have been there, who have done that, and who can help motivate us, maybe help remind us of why we started writing in the first place, it can be wonderful. Look no further than classic F. Scott Fitzgerald on Writing, a pretty slim manual, not so much a how-to manual, but maybe a manual of how to think about writing. And again, very classic. This is obviously an entirely different era than the one we're currently living in, but the principles that he discusses in this book, which is a little dusty, it's been sitting on my shelf a long time, are just tried and true and really foundational, I think, regardless of whether you are writing more literary work or sci-fi, romance, one of the genres. It doesn't matter. Writing is writing, and the inspiration to write is the inspiration to write. So again, for some very classic, sort of old school advice and approaches, ways to think about it, I really recommend this book. It might be a little hard to find. I'm not sure if it's still in print or not, but it's a good one, and I'm guessing you can probably find a copy. Similar a little bit to that, and again, I love her approach, is Brenda Euland's If You Want to Write. I discovered this book, I was probably about 30, I think, when I discovered this book. And the suggestion to get it came from a writer friend of mine back in the day. And I love the subtitle of this book, A Book About Art, Independence, and Spirit. So Brenda Euland takes a very spirited approach in this book. Her wisdom is beautiful, like Fitzgerald's. It's somewhat timeless, but really challenges writers to think of the work not just as something separate from themselves, but something that informs the spirit and emerges from the spirit. And I just love this book. Again, Brenda Euland is, I think, an underappreciated genius. We don't hear a lot about her, but there are so many great pull quotes from this one. Again, I've had this for many years. I love it. I highly recommend it. And I'm actually thinking I need to crack it open and dive back into it because it's been a little while. This book, Eric Mazel's Coaching the Artist Within, I stumbled across this. I want to say it was in a thrift store. I think it was a library book sale. And I had never heard of this author. I had never heard of this book. And I flipped through it and I thought, boy, there's some good stuff in here, just on a cursory read, just sort of quickly looking at it as I was standing in the book sale. And the the tagline or the subtitle on this one, Advice for Writers, Actors, Visual Artists, and Musicians from America's Foremost Creativity Coach. That can sound a little gimmicky, right? Life coach, creativity coach. I'm not putting those down, but it can sound a little gimmicky, right? It's just sort of like a creativity coach. I don't know. This is one of those books that I find myself when I read it underlining, writing down quotes in my journal, tweeting quotes, putting them on social media, because it's just, the word that comes to mind is pithy. You'll be reading this book and all of a sudden you'll just get to a line that just stops you in your tracks and makes you go, wait a minute, I have to think about this, because this touches on so many things simultaneously. Wonderful, wonderful book. I've never read anything else by Maisel, but I highly recommend this one. If you have heard of any of these authors or read other books by these authors or read these books that I'm mentioning today, leave a comment. Let me know what you think. And if there are any others you'd recommend, I'm always open for a good writing inspiration book. I need it just as much as anyone else needs it, for sure, especially when I'm teaching and life is happening and life is busy. Yeah, say no more. Writing inspiration is a good thing. Okay, Steinbeck, obviously a classic, one of my favorites. Steinbeck is right up there in my probably top 3 or 5 authors of all time. So suffice it to say, I'm a huge, huge Steinbeck fan. I got to learn from a wonderful Steinbeck scholar not far from Cannery Row in my undergraduate days, and just took a real deep dive in his classes into Steinbeck's works. And of course, getting to visit the Monterey area was just amazing. It was less than an hour away, and it's just such a beautiful area, and just learning the history along with just the geographical natural beauty of the place, and of course his artistry and genius as an author. Journal of a Novel. So this book is actually a series of letters that John wrote to his editor about while he was writing East of Eden, which of course is one of Steinbeck's huge blockbusters. So as it says on the back, each working day from January 29th to November 1st, 1951. So again, we're getting some sort of mid-century old school wisdom here in these letters. John Steinbeck warmed up to the work of writing East of Eden with a letter to the late Pascal Covici, his friend and editor at Viking Press. I won't read the whole thing, but much like Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet, this book is a very intimate look at the mind of someone who was creating what would become, in many ways, the great American novel of its time. So you could also say that about Grapes of Wrath or other Steinbeck works, but East of Eden was, and is, I think, groundbreaking and really changed literature in many ways. So hearing from Steinbeck writing to his editor, who was also of course, intimately acquainted with this story as it was being written, is very special, and it is very almost voyeuristic in a non-creepy way to sort of read what's happening in his mind as he's, as it says here, warming up each day. It's almost like he's writing a journal in the form of a letter to his friend and his editor. Wonderful insights into the mind of not just a genius, like, oh, he's up there and we're down here, but also in the mind of a writer. And any writer can relate to what he says in here, whether you're a beginner or you are yourself quite a genius. Bonnie Friedman's Writing Past Dark. Okay, the subtitle will tell you what it is that I love about this book. Envy, fear, distraction, and other dilemmas in a writer's life. Gee, we can't relate to any of those, can we? Anywho, another slim volume, right? It doesn't take long to read this one. And again, Bonnie Friedman just nails it. She just goes there in a non-judgmental way, but in a very honest way. Hey, the green monster, right? I've been there. I have had friends who, while I was struggling very much as a young writer, were finding great success with their debut novels and even their subsequent novels. And I was happy for them, but that was really hard. I've actually talked about that in earlier episodes of this podcast. Writing Past Dark, Bonnie Friedman. Again, I don't know if all of these books are still in print. If they're not, though, you can probably still find a used copy, I'm guessing. Well worth it. Quick read. And if you are struggling with some of the psychological aspects, the more difficult psychological aspects of being a writer, this is your book. As is Annie Dillard's classic, The Writing Life. I was first introduced to Annie Dillard in any depth as an undergraduate. I think I'd probably heard of her before then, but one of my professors as an undergraduate was a huge fan of the Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, which is one of the books that really made Annie Dillard super famous. So this is sort of her treatise on, as it says, the writing life. And I love the Boston Globe's review of this book. They called it a kind of spiritual Strunk and White. Hello, Strunk and White. I mean, E.B. White, one of my favorite authors of all time, who among us of a certain age, Gen Xers, I'm talking to you, didn't find themselves sobbing in a corner of the classroom or their bedroom or their living room reading Charlotte's Web, right? In like 3rd through 5th grade. Am I right? Is it just me? I don't think so. Anyway, anything that compares to E.B. White is a winner for me, and this book is no different. Annie Dillard is sort of known for her very gentle, sensitive approach. She's not going to wallop you over the head with a cartoon mallet telling you you're an idiot for not, getting to your writing desk, but she has a very sort of interior, also spiritual, and yet very earthy delivery, in my opinion, that makes this a very gentle, wonderful read. Okay, I'm going to save this one till last. The Way of the Writer, Reflections on the Art and Craft of Storytelling by Charles Johnson. This is a book I picked up last year. I really love this book. Johnson has been writing for a long time. He's a very accomplished writer and human in general. And his approach is very personal on one hand because he is writing a lot about his own experiences and his own perspectives and his own projects. But he's... what do I want to say? He's just, he's able to word things in a way that make the very personal sort of universal. And I love that. I love, because it's sort of like an autobiography in a way. I felt when I was reading this for the first time that I was reading about someone very specific and about that person's work, but also much of what he was writing about his journey as a writer just felt very universal to me, felt like very relatable, very human, and I really appreciated that. So again, Charles Johnson, The Way of the Writer. I am quite sure this is very actively still in print. It was a very popular book when it came out, and I do believe it still remains so to this day. So pick this one up too. This is not specifically a writing book, but it is still wonderful. Twyla Tharp's The Creative Habit, Learn It and Use It for Life. So the New York Times Book Review called this was an exuberant, philosophically ambitious self-help book for the creatively challenged. So this is especially for people, and not just writers, right? But people who might be sort of blocked in their creativity, people who might be feeling just like, oh, I don't know what I want to do, or maybe which path I want to choose, or I know I want to be a writer, but I don't have any ideas and I don't know how to get started and I can't afford to get an MFA, or I don't want to get an MFA, and all you start, it's the quandary, right? That just happens. But it's beautifully written, it's articulately written, and it's very much like my impression of Twyla Tharp herself, very specific. Maybe can lean toward the didactic a little bit in some areas at some points, maybe not as warm as Annie Dillard or Bonnie Friedman, but just a really overall a great treatise on what it means to be a creative person, what it takes to find success, however we may define that, as creative people. And I just like her sort of how-to approach. And as the NYT book review said, it's sort of a self-help approach as well. So it's a little bit of a kick in the pants, as it were. I really like this one a lot. Okay, last but not least, I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to wrap this up with a book that meant so much to me as a young writer and moved me so deeply with its simplicity and its wisdom and its humor and it's a total approachability. It wasn't at all intimidating to read. It was very welcoming, very funny, and it was a huge hit when it was released it was the late 80s or the 90s. I came across it in the early 90s, and I think it was pretty new then. I should look. Give me just a second here. 1986, so it was actually released several years before I found it. Natalie Goldberg's Writing Down the Bones. Okay, let's talk about Writing Down the Bones. This book, to a graduate student in the 1990s, a writing graduate student, was just like Christmas. It was, again, very approachable. It's broken down. You can see my copy is like water stained and kind of ripped up, and it's kind of wrinkly. I was probably reading this in the bathtub, for crying out loud. So Natalie Goldberg takes a very Zen approach in this book. It's very simple. She's very into the concept of Zen mind, beginner's mind. At the time I first picked this up, I was actually becoming very interested in Zen Buddhism, and I was sitting Zazen, and I was just loving that. And I still carry those principles when I can, when I remember to, into my life as much as possible, because I find they're just really beautiful principles, along with the principles of other religions, Christianity and some others, Hinduism. Zen Buddhism is very much infused throughout these pages, not in a preachy way, not in a you should become a Buddhist kind of way, or you should sit Zazen, but you can tell that, or I feel like I can tell, I shouldn't assume that you can, that the very short writing exercises, the commentary, the little lessons in here spring from the mind of a person who is very human, not able to be perfect, recognizes that, recognizes her own struggles, but again, just humorous and lovely. And I'm just sort of looking at the back here. The secret of creativity, Natalie Goldberg makes clear, is to subtract rules for writing, not add them. It's a process of uneducation rather than education. So it's sort of like getting back to basics, getting back to who you are as a writer. One of the things you may have heard me say pretty often on this channel, this podcast, is keep in close touch with what made you want to become a writer in the first place. This is something I have to do to keep sort of finding my way back to writing and wanting to be a writer, even though I'm in a particular season of my life where I am teaching every day. Very often teaching is my job, and so it's really something that I'm immersed in. I'm also doing a lot of editing as the founder of Altitude Press, this very tiny press, and we're doing flash fiction right now, and so I find myself taking on the editorial role, and I really love it, and I think I'm fairly good at it. We'll see. But when it comes to getting back to writing, when I have to find my way back to, hey, myself as a storyteller here, first and foremost, this is the book I will pick up, and I can turn to just about any one of her exercises. This one's called A Tourist in Your Own Town. And she says, writers write about things that other people don't pay much attention to. For instance, our tongues, elbows, water coming out of a water faucet, the kind of garbage trucks New York City has, the color purple of a faded sign in a small town. And from there, she goes on to suggest that you, as a writer, start noticing certain things and write them down. She has one called Don't Marry the Fly, which I will never forget the first time I read that. She basically talks about, as writers, if we tend to go into such minute detail about like the color of a person's eyes when they're sad, that it can tend to absolutely bog down the narrative and the forward momentum of the story, and it sort of sucks the energy out of the writing. I'm paraphrasing. That's my interpretation. That's not what she's saying. To find out what she says about that and so many other really great things, pick up a copy of Writing Down the Bones. I hope this one is still in print. It was published by Shambhala, very well-known press, and I'm hoping they're still printing this. And if not, again, finding a used copy should be possible, because this was a pretty huge breakout book when it came out. And Judith Guest, who wrote, again, younger people won't get this reference, but people of a certain age will, Ordinary People, which was turned into this blockbuster, heartbreaking, just heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching film, writes the foreword of this. And that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. I'm sure at the time that was a wonderful thing, because Judith Guest is no small author. So anyway, those are my picks for some of the greatest writing inspiration books. I would love to hear yours if you have, and I know I'm leaving some out that as soon as I stop recording, I'll be like, oh, I didn't mention that one. But it's okay. So let me know what yours are. Give me some suggestions. I'd love to add to my collection. All right, everyone, I will see you next time.